call highland areas? Okay, that's actually not even half. Okay, how many people work in both highland and lowland areas? Raise your hands. Okay, how many people work almost all in lowland areas? Raise your hands. Okay, so I guess actually the highland areas are predominant. Okay. Do we have French translation in French or okay. And so it won't be simultaneous translation or what? Oh, they have earphones. Okay. Okay. Well, let's start. We haven't talked at all yet. None of us, neither the presentation before this or this presentation, about highland varieties. All those species. I shouldn't say varieties. I should say species. All those species that they were testing and that I talked about this morning are lowland species. None of those will go much above 1,500 meters. So for those of you who are working in the highlands, now we'll talk about the species you can use. Okay. Now lab will go up to about 1,800, but most of the others at about 1,500 they stop really growing very well. Now, a lot of them will grow. You know, if you take jack bean up to 1,800 or 1,900 meters, it will grow, but it no longer has the vigor we need. It won't produce enough biomass to be worthwhile. So, you know, at about 1,500 meters, we have to stop using the lowland species because they just don't grow very much. And we start using species that, in fact, grow better if they're at 2,000 meters or 2,500 meters, okay? So I'll talk about 4 of those species that I think are probably the best ones for us to use. Is that okay? And a lot of what I'm saying is right in my book, if you happen to get it. Okay, probably the best species for highland areas in general is what's called runner bean or scarlet runner bean. Okay, runner bean or scarlet runner bean. The scarlet because it has a sort of a reddish flower. In fact, it's a sort of reddish orange. Once you've seen the flower, you'll always be able to recognize it. It's a different color than most red flowers. Now, sometimes it has a white flower, so then, you know, it's like a lot of other plants. But anyway, scarlet runner bean. And the scientific name of this is what are common beans? Is something vulgaris? Huh? Yeah, Phaseolus. Okay, the runner bean is Phaseolus coccineus. Coccineus. C-O-C-C. The rest you can guess. Okay? This is a plant that produces a tremendous amount of biomass, probably more biomass even than Mucuna, although they don't grow at the same elevation, so it's kind of difficult to compare. But it produces a tremendous amount of biomass. I would guess it's around 80 or 90 kilos per hectare. Even though we're talking about a colder environment where most things grow less well, it does a very good job. In fact, in a lot of cases, it grows so well that it will pull down even good maize. I mean, even if the maize is growing very well, it'll pull it down because there's too much biomass. So no, this isn't my. This is something else. So there's nothing to look at up there. For this presentation, I just found out I was going to be doing it yesterday, so I don't have. Are you looking at something in particular? Do you have? Oh, you have something about runner bean there. Okay. Yeah, Phaseolus coccineus. Let's see. It says the beans are known for their sweetness. All over Latin America, runner beans will cost more in the market than regular beans because people like the runner beans. They taste better. That's not true in Kenya. It's the other way around. But in Latin America, everywhere, people like these beans better. 4 feet apart. Okay, see, they're talking about planting the seed 3 or 4 feet apart, and that's because it produces so much biomass. And since we do almost always associate our green manure cover crops with maize, it'll grow up the maize and pull it over. Oh, this is written by Echo. Okay. Okay. Now, what are the advantages of the runner bean? First of all, it's by far the best producer of biomass for areas between 1,500 and 3,000 meters in elevation. There's nothing else that comes close. Okay? Secondly, it can be intercropped very well with maize if we get the right distance. Now, with some types of runner bean, you can plant it much closer together. And also, something I never learned in all my years in Latin America, but in Kenya and Ethiopia, they have a bushy type runner bean that we don't have in Latin America. It's a bushy type runner bean. I believe it has a white flower. And in fact, the Kikuyu people around Thika, which is just outside of Nairobi, they plant their maize and they plant 3 kinds of beans. 2 of them are common beans and the other one is runner bean. And they will tell you very clearly, well, this one over here, the runner bean, is the one that fertilizes the soil. The other give us nice beans to eat, but this one also fertilizes the soil. And it does fertilize the soil much, much better than any common beans. Okay? And that bushy type, if you can get hold of it, I don't think it exists here in Rwanda. The bushy type, you can get it, like I say, in Kenya. In fact, it's probably available most of the year in the bean market in Nairobi. Like I say, it grows very well together with maize. You don't have to worry about it pulling down the maize, so you can grow it, you can put 3 or 4 seeds per square meter and have a very, very nice cover. It will control the weeds very well. If you weed the field once, and after that, the runner bean will take care of the weeds, will control the weeds, and it will produce a lot of seed, and it's very good at fertilizing the soil. In 2 years, you should be harvesting double the maize you're harvesting now at least, if not more. Okay? It's a climber. Well, all the varieties except the one in Kenya with the white flowers are climbers, but that one is bushy type, and if you could get that, that would be really good. Now, I believe, I've been told several times, I haven't actually seen it, but I believe that runner bean in general is grown here in the higher areas of Rwanda. Does anybody know for sure? Does anybody here have any experience with runner bean?
I had a farmer growing a bean with red flowers, and that's what he called it.
Runner bean?
Yeah, I couldn't confirm it.
Well, were they sort of reddish orangish? Do you remember?
It had a red flower that was about like that.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was probably it then. I've been told by a number of different people that runner bean does exist here in the highest areas of Rwanda. I think some people told me it was one area where they grow a lot of it is sort of west of huh? In the north. The northwest. Okay, yeah. That's what I've been told, yeah. So you know it's there too. Okay, fine. So it does exist here in the northwest of Rwanda, okay? So you can very likely get seed there, right? Okay. Now, it also has a tuber. At least most of the varieties do, and the ones here in Africa anyway. And so you don't even have to plant it a second and third year. Usually it'll go for about 3 years. And you don't even have to replant it and waste seed. You can just let the tuber sprout again. Okay? Now, are there any questions about runner bean before we go on to the other species? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, with the bushy type, like I said, they grow 3 kinds of bean, and one of them is runner bean, and they grow all 3. They grow all 3 plants within a meter square. So I would guess if you aren't planting other beans, oh, and it grows about that high. So if you're going to grow other common beans, it's got to be a common bean plant that grows about the same height. If you're just growing runner bean with maize, I would say probably 3 plants per square meter, maybe 4. In all cases, when we're talking about spacing, I don't believe that any agronomist can stand here and say, okay, it's got to be exactly 3 seeds per square meter, because that depends on how much, how fertile your soil is. It depends on how much rainfall you're getting, whether you have droughts. It depends on the varieties of maize that you use and the varieties of beans. It depends on all sorts of different factors. Each farmer, what we should do is encourage each farmer to try it out and try out somewhat different spacings and see what they like best. Okay? With the runner bean, I would suggest you start out at about 3 seeds per square meter, but let the farmer try 4, let him try 2, or her try 2, and they will gradually figure out which one is best for them. Okay? Under their situation of soil, climate, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Now in Kigali here, does the market, do people buy runner beans? Do you know?
Not that I know. Even the farmers there, it's very little.
They don't grow very much of it. Yeah. Okay. Well, it could well be that if we taught some cooking classes, we could run up and get some recipes from the Kikuyu people or something. It could well be they'd eat a lot of them, because all over Latin America and in parts of Kenya and Ethiopia, it's widely sold. Yeah. In fact, there are more than 1 million farmers in Latin America that grow runner beans. Okay. Also, if you were working in Uganda, people were growing runner beans down in the southwest corner, right near Rwanda and the DRC. And there they weren't growing them in their fields. They were only growing them on the fences around their vegetable gardens. But you can easily grow them in the field. Okay? Any other questions about runner bean? Okay. Pardon? The plant stays on the ground? Oh yeah, right. Okay. Well, I don't think the lima bean has a red flower like that, does it? Okay, well that's probably the easiest way to tell it. Okay, the next one I would like to talk about is fava bean. You probably have that there. Okay, fava bean. It's boy, I'm having trouble with the scientific names today. Well, I'll tell you in a minute. It'll come to me. Pardon? Vicia fava. Vicia fava. Okay? Vicia fava. This is an upright plant. How many people know fava beans? Wow, not hardly anybody. Okay. Fava beans are grown in many countries in the world, in Africa, Asia, and a few African countries. Does anybody know whether you can get seeds in Rwanda? Yes. Well, you can get them. Yeah, you can get them lots of places. Okay, the fava bean. Well, maybe we shouldn't even talk about it if we can't get the seed. Yeah, it is widely grown in Egypt. In fact, it's a staple in certain parts of Egypt. Is anybody interested in the fava bean? Do you want to try it? Or? Really? Okay. Well, that's strange. I've never seen that happen. Okay. But you probably only grew a very, very small plot, right? Yeah. Okay.
Does it have any? If it has any particular benefits, I mean, I try to get.
Well, if you can get the bushy type scarlet runner bean, then I wouldn't see a whole lot of reason to use the fava bean. The fava bean, or if you're growing a crop, for instance, if you're growing sorghum or millet, but people don't grow sorghum and millet in the Highlands, do they? Okay, well, if you're growing sorghum or millet, then the fava bean would be a very good one to use, because the fava bean is erect and does not climb the plant, so it's not going to pull over your sorghum or millet. The sorghum and millet doesn't have as strong a stem usually as maize, so if you try to plant scarlet runner bean with it, you won't have a chance of harvesting much millet or sorghum, because it'll all get pulled over. The fava bean is very popular where people know about it and eat it. It can be eaten either fried or it can be eaten green. Well, a bean is still immature, green in soups. It can be eaten as a snack food. If it's roasted or toasted, it becomes very hard. It's like a jawbreaker, but it's very tasty. There are lots of different ways to eat it. And like I say, it's erect, so it's not going to pull over your plant. Well, now, if they're growing it in Egypt, there must be also lowland varieties of it, huh? Okay. I don't see a whole lot of interest in it. Okay. Okay, it's also called Broadbean. Has anybody ever heard it by that name? Okay. I think that's mostly in Britain. Okay, here you can see what it looks like. The beans are actually somewhat flatter than the lima beans. Yeah. Anyway, the pods are about that long. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the broad bean or fava bean? Yeah?
I want to share our experience. I think you have forgotten Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia grows a lot of fava bean in the highlands.
That's right. That's right.
So we have different varieties and we use it for different purposes. It's also very important to improve soil fertility. So some farmers, they, intercrop with some forage, and they harvest the forage for animal feed and the crops for human food. So we have a lot of fava bean production.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe it's good to.
In fact,
Yeah,
probably Ethiopia has more different green manure cover crops than any other country in Africa. I mean, Ethiopia has a very wide variety of different green manure cover crops that are used there. Another one is chickpea. Chickpea is a very interesting bean for several reasons. And it's widely eaten. For instance, in India, there's probably 1 billion people who eat it. That's 1,000 million. The chickpea is one that we have not spent too much attention on because we just didn't realize some of its qualities until just recently. The chickpea actually is interesting because it goes from about 500 meters up to about 2,000 meters. So it's somewhere in between low elevation and high elevation. How high do they grow it in Ethiopia? Do you know? Up to what elevation? About 2,000. Maybe up to 2,500, something like that. Okay. But I've seen it. The reason we've really become interested in it recently is there's a huge area in Tanzania between Dodoma and Mwanza, closer to Mwanza, and it is grown by hundreds and hundreds of farmers there. This is an area that's droughty. I don't know what the average rainfall is, but it can't be over 600 millimeters or something like that. And yet they grow it during the dry season. So it must be tremendously drought resistant. And in Ethiopia, usually you grow it, you relay it into some other crop, and then it grows through the dry season, right? The chickpea. Right. Okay. After they've harvested their main crop during the rainy season, then they plant it usually before the main crop is harvested, which means what relay means, and then it grows through the dry season on what we call the residual moisture. It's the moisture that is just left over from the rainy season. Yeah. Which means it's very, very drought resistant. It also has another characteristic that we're very interested in, and that is that of all the edible grain legumes, or okay, there you can see some photos of the plant. Of all the edible grain legumes, it is the only one that cattle won't eat. And that's because it has some very small spines on it, and they're just large enough so that cattle don't like it in their mouths. So that, pardon? It has small spines on the plant, thorns, but they're very small. And so the cattle don't like it in their mouth, and so they won't eat it out in the field. But the grain is totally edible. There are no anti-nutritional factors. And like I say, somewhere around 1 billion people in India eat chickpeas. So for intermediate heights, this has a lot of potential. We can't tell you too much about how to grow it and everything because we've just become interested in it in the last 2 or 3 years. What else can I tell you about it? I suspect that it doesn't produce very much biomass. The plantings I've seen didn't produce much biomass, but that's because it's being grown in a situation of very, very little water. So you know, it's more biomass than you're going to get out of almost anything else except jack bean or something. And jack bean, of course, is not edible. So here's an edible, very nutritious bean that can be grown during the dry season, which means that you know, almost any farmer can grow it because we all have dry seasons. Okay. And if any of you live, like for instance in Tanzania or other places where you can get a hold of this, it would be really good to experiment with it. I would guess it also grows intercropped with maize. It probably grows better around 1,500 meters, a little higher than most of you live, but this is certainly a bean that we ought to be looking at. Okay. Okay. There were 2 more that I wanted to mention. Pardon? Yes, Lupin. Okay, Lupin. Now this is another one that's grown in Ethiopia, right? It has a white seed about that big. There's some seed out here if you want to see it and maybe even take some. We're not sure what the scientific name of this lupin that's used in Ethiopia. I do know much better one that's used in the Andes. The seed looks exactly the same, and in fact they have to do the same processing to eat it. So I suspect that the lupin in Ethiopia is the same one, although some people have given a different name. Some call it Lupinus caudatus, but in South America we know it by Lupinus, I think it's albus. Okay? Now, the one that I know from South America is very interesting also because it fixes over 400 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. That's the equivalent of about something like 18 sacks of urea. It's double what any farmer in the United States would probably ever use. Okay? It has way more. In fact, what you have to do is plant it fairly far apart because if you plant it right close together, it's too much nitrogen for the maize plant, and the maize plant won't even produce seed. It just produces lots of leaves. Pardon? Okay. Yeah, if you need a lot of nitrogen, and most of the soils, smallholder farmers in Africa, the by far the nutrient that is most affecting their productivity is nitrogen. I mean, I realize the fertilizer companies have been trying to tell us that we were headed for a huge phosphorus deficiency or even crisis here in Africa, but that's not true. By far the biggest problem we have all over Africa is nitrogen, a deficiency of nitrogen, okay? So a plant like this could be very useful. It's also edible. This lupin is edible. The seeds are, you have to wash the seeds in a stream, leave them in a stream with running water for about 2 days. That's what they do in Ethiopia, right? Huh?
Yeah, I think you are right. We have two types.
Oh, you
One
have
is,
two types.
Yeah, I think the sweet lupin. I think this one is newly introduced. It's multi-purpose for human food and animal feed. But one which we have in the past is bitter
Okay, now that's
lupin.
Okay, that's
So-
why I'm confused. then.
Yeah, as you said, I think you roast it, you soak it in the water for 2 days, then people use it to.
Okay,
they
okay.
eat
Well,
it,
that
yeah,
then that
yeah.
clears up what
Yeah.
the confusion because people have told me no, what they have in Ethiopia is Lupinus caudatus, but
Yeah.
that must be the other one.
Yeah,
The one
so-
I'm talking about is Lupinus, and I'm having a hard time, huh? Albus. Okay, Lupinus albus. Yeah. Okay, Lupinus albus is the one that is edible for sure, and it's very, very nutritious. But you do have to let it sit in running water for about 3 days, 2 days, something like that. So here you have a plant that will produce all the nitrogen you could ever wish for. It grows quite vigorously. I've seen it, it grows very well, produces a lot of biomass. It's edible and easily edible. It doesn't take a whole lot of work like some things. It'll fix up your soil very quickly. Okay, you'll have all the nitrogen you could use.
Is there any intercropping systems?
Yes, we use it with maize. If people are growing millet and sorghum here at high altitudes, why it would go very well with those. Now, actually, the tarwi, how low do you plant it in Ethiopia? Tarwi is the edible lupin. What elevation above sea level? Yeah.
You know, this sweet lupin and bitter lupin, they require acidic soil, nitty soil, so they grow in the highlands.
Well,
So it's above 1,800, in between 1,800
okay.
and 2,500, 400.
Well, actually, I know in the Andes, the Lupinus albus, the edible kind, goes up to 3,000 meters, and it comes down to about 1,500. It grows better at 2,000. So it's a higher elevation plant than any of the others we know of. I mean, it'll go up as high as you can. Well, in Ethiopia, you don't even grow maize that high, right? You need to get some varieties from the Andes because they have maize that goes up to 3,500 meters.
Understanding on the altitude. I think in Ethiopia, the altitude and rainfall or temperature, they correlate very much. So, but in some other countries, the altitude can be less, but rainfall can be high. So
Yeah. Well, of course, it
I
depends
think
on. Yeah, it depends on how
yeah.
far you are from the equator and things like that.
Yeah.
But it'll go higher than any place you'd ever want to farm here in Rwanda. Okay, or you could farm. I mean, Rwanda just doesn't have mountains high enough for the lupinus. I mean, I shouldn't say it that way. The lupinus will go higher than most of the places here in Rwanda, but in the highest places in Rwanda, you should be able to grow it. And like I say, it's extremely good at fertilizing the soil, better than basically any other. It fixes more nitrogen than any other legume I know of. And well, okay, that's enough. Okay, now let me make some comments about the lowland species, because there were some questions raised in the last session that we ought to deal with. One is, Mucuna is a very vigorous plant. It's very good at controlling weeds. If you have, for instance, nutgrass, which is a terrible weed, all you have to do is plant the Mucuna early in the rainy season and let it cover the nutgrass for about 6 months or 5 months, and your nutgrass is dead. And that's about the only way to control it that I know of, unless you're going to spray herbicides year after year after year. You can actually pretty much get rid of it by having it. The only way you can do it is by covering the plant for 5 or 6 months, and Mucuna will do that. It's very good at covering. I could show you pictures of whole fields of Mucuna where you can't see more than 1 or 2 weeds in the whole field. It's very good at controlling weeds. It's also very good at fertilizing the soil. What it's not good at is intercropping with maize or sorghum or millet or anything else. With sorghum or millet, it'll pull them down, and with maize, the problem is it'll climb up and cover it and kill it, unless you plant it very late. Now, in Kenya, the Ministry of Agriculture has done some experiments where they've grown it. They've started it growing like about 35 days or something after they plant the maize, which means that it won't grow very well because there's too much shade. So what they do is they let it struggle at first, so the maize won't get covered. And then when the maize is about ready to produce, maybe a month before, they cut the lower leaves off the maize so that the Mucuna will get some sunlight, and then it will grow quite well, and you've harvested the maize before the maize is damaged by the Mucuna. Mucuna is also very good for animals. Animals will eat it, although you've got to be careful that they don't eat only Mucuna, because the same anti-nutritional factors that make it bad for us to eat can also affect animals to some extent. So that's, I did want to say that about Mucuna. We don't consider it one of the best green manure cover crops for lowland areas precisely because of that. It's very difficult to associate with other plants because it's one of the most aggressive green manures we know of. That means it's very good for controlling weeds if you don't have anything else in your field. Okay? So, like for instance, one of the things we haven't talked about is wastelands. Land that won't produce anything, that farmers have just given up on. You can bring those wastelands back into production very easily with green manure cover crops. The best one to use is jack bean, which is also called cannavalia. Okay? That's the big white bean they have out here. Okay? It is wonderful for restoring wastelands. If there's been grass growing there for 4, 5, 6 years, then you may have to plow it once in order to get rid of that grass, because if the grass has a really well-developed root system, the jack bean won't be able to compete with it. But if it's just grass from a field where you had maize last year, then there's no problem. You can grow jack bean there. And I've only seen 3 places in the whole world where jack bean didn't grow well. All 3 of them had a pH of less than 4.5, which is quite rare here. Okay? Now, there are places in Rwanda where you have that kind of a pH and where the jack bean won't grow very well. But in most of Rwanda and all of Uganda and Tanzania that I know of, and Kenya, jack bean will grow very well. So for wasteland, where you're not trying to grow any other crop because no other crops will grow, then the Mucuna can be your best bet. But you can't intercrop Mucuna easily with other plants. Okay? I also would strongly recommend that you not eat it. Okay? It has anti-nutritional factors that will cause all sorts of problems. You'll get headaches and so forth and so on. Now, there are places where they eat Mucuna. They have to cook it between 4 and 6 times for 3 hours each time, throwing out the water. And if they only cook it 4 times, they've also got to soak it overnight and some other stuff. I just think that's way too much work. I wouldn't expect my wife to do that. So I don't recommend eating Mucuna. Okay? In fact, there's a very, very itchy kind of Mucuna that has a black seed. Or how many of you know that plant? It's very itchy, like that, for about 3 days. Wow. Okay. Okay. This itchy Mucuna, don't ever plant it in people's fields. Okay. It has a black seed. Now there are black seeded Mucunas that aren't itchy, But if it starts growing, if when the pod starts growing, it has little hairs on it, get rid of it. Absolutely get rid of it. It is the worst. It's like nettles. It itches terribly. It itches so much people often scratch themselves until they draw blood. And it will last, the itching will last for 3 days. I think the best name for that plant is the one they have in India. They call it devil bean. And it is, I can't imagine the devil treating us any worse. Pardon? Okay, but it'll only keep them out for about 3 months out of the year. So, but anyway. So Mucuna is a difficult, it's very useful when we can use it, but it's a difficult plant to use, especially if we want to intercrop it with anything. Okay? There were a couple other questions that were answered, that were asked earlier in the session. Another plant we should not, another bean we should not eat is the jack bean, the Convalia. It has a chemical in it called conovalina that doesn't allow the body to absorb calcium. So if you only eat it 2 or 3 times, you know, sometime or other, if you're really hungry and you just don't have anything else, eat it 2 or 3 times, but then stop eating it. And don't eat it again for a couple of months. Because if you eat it very much, your body won't be getting calcium, and pretty soon you're going to have troubles with your bones and your teeth and things like that. So it's not a good plant to eat. Okay? Now, another thing I should say is that some of the other legumes, the edible ones, especially lab, are extremely good for animals. Okay, lab is probably the best single food you could give to your animals, and they love it. If one farmer plants lab in a village and nobody else does, in the dry season, every cow in the village is going to be on top of his lab. We've had experiments where we were trying out, we were comparing different legumes. We'd have 15 or 20 legumes in a plot, and a farmer would come along and cut the fence so his cattle could eat, and they would finish off the lab before they touched anything else. Okay? It's highly palatable. In fact, are we just about?
We are.
We need to finish?
Now everyone, you're free to stay, free to go.
Okay. We'll give a chance for people to leave. But anyway, for instance, in Honduras, one of the things that the large-scale farmers are doing, they grow maize and lab together. By the way, in areas anywhere near Kenya, lab also is a good commercial crop because the Kikuyus in Kenya eat tons and tons of lab. Okay, and in northern Tanzania, there are also areas where the Tanzanians eat lab. It's highly edible, and you can cook it all sorts of different ways. And the leaves, like I said earlier in my presentation, the leaves of lab are a nutritionist's dream. Learn to cook them, and you know it's absolutely wonderful for nutritional purposes. But the farmers in Honduras in Central America, some of the large-scale farmers, and when I left, there were about 30 or 40 that were doing this. One person discovered it, but what they do is they grow the lab together with the maize. They harvest the maize and sell it. They harvest the lab and sell it. And then they just put their cattle, and they leave both plants growing there together. They put in a certain number of cattle, depending on how large the space is, calculated so that they will finish eating all the maize, stover, and the lab right down to the ground at about the time the rains start again. So they'll have the cattle in there for 6 months. They don't have to move them around. They don't have to do anything with them. They just close the gate and leave them there. Nobody has to take care of the cattle. And for 6 months, during the entire 6-month dry season, the cattle will continue to get fatter and fatter, and will continue to produce large quantities of milk. It's absolutely incredible. And then when they get it down to the ground, the rainy season has come, so they take the cattle out, let them eat all the grass that's growing all over the place, and they plant the lab and maize again. Now, because the cattle are eating all of the lab, it's not going to improve the soil much, but they're getting a wonderful, you know, and I just met a farmer in Malawi who learned about this system in Honduras and is using it in Malawi, and she says this was I think a British woman. She said it was by far the best way to raise cattle in Africa. Okay, so if some of you have a lot of cattle or are interested in having a lot, this might be something you could look into. Okay.
Let's give Roland a big thanks.
And I'll stick around for questions if some of you have questions.
Don't forget his book is available. If you want a signed copy, I don't think he'll charge any more.
I won't charge very much. Yeah.
You mentioned something about ratooning when it comes to Pigeon Pea. So more examples on that. Would you leave it in there?
Okay, this is really, really important in areas where people either eat or also grow pigeon pea. Cajanus cajan, no? There was a name in French, bon. Anyway. Oh, it's kunde. Oh, imikunde. Okay. Well, it has different names. The Kenyan name in Swahili is different. But okay. Pigeon pea, there is a way you can make it much more valuable than the way people are managing it right now. Okay, and this was a technology developed in Zambia. What you do is you plant the pigeon pea like you always do. When you harvest it, which is usually a month into the dry season, something like that, it takes a while to produce, maybe 6-7 months. When you harvest it, you leave it. You leave it standing. You just take the beans off or take the branches off, whatever you want to do, but you leave the plant. You don't kill it. Because remember, our golden rule with green manure cover crops is you want green leaves when the next crop comes. So if you kill it, the leaves are going to sit on the ground for 4 or 5 months, and you'll lose all your nitrogen. Okay? So you leave the plant there. You let it continue to grow through the dry season. If the cattle are going to be eating it during that period, if there's free grazing cattle, then plant 6 or 7 plants per square meter instead of 3 or 4. And that means that the stalk, because there's so much competition between the plants, the stalk will never get woody. It will stay green, and the cattle can eat all the beans and leaves and everything off of it and never break the stem. So the stem will still be in good shape. Okay? When the next rainy season comes, you plant your maize with the pigeon peas still standing there. About 10 days or 2 weeks after you've planted your maize, the pigeon pea will have grown all sorts of leaves again, green leaves. You cut them down, and those become your fertilizer. And a wonderful fertilizer it is. Then you cut off the pigeon pea plant just above the knee. Okay? About 60 or 70 centimeters off the ground. Pardon? Okay, about 8 days after you've planted your maize. Okay, then if you want to, it will sprout even after it's been cut off. It'll sprout lots of leaves, and you can cut them off 2 weeks later or something, and you'll have a second application of nitrogen, what the scientists call a side dressing. Okay, there are several advantages of this system. First of all, you don't have to use seed to plant it every year. The pigeon pea, when it's ratooned like that, will grow for about 4 years. So each year you ratoon it, and you don't have to waste seed planting it. But that's a small advantage. The big advantages are the following. Ratooned pigeon pea, the first year, has a whole year's worth of root growth. Okay? The second year, it has 2 years of root growth. If any of you have noticed, trees do not die in a drought. Trees are, at least once they're more than a year old, are totally resistant to drought. The same thing happens to pigeon pea. If it's got a whole year's root growth under it, you won't have any problems with drought. Okay? You will have a very good crop of pigeon peas, at least for the first, second, and third year. The fourth year, it diminishes quite a bit. Okay? So you have a totally drought-resistant food crop right from the second year you started using green manure cover crops. Okay? That is tremendously important. In fact, I know some farmers that discovered this some time ago in Malawi, and what they do is now, a fair number of them, they plant 1/4 of their pigeon pea this year, and then they plant from seed 1/4 of it next year, and a quarter of it third year, a quarter of the fourth year. And so after that, in any 1 year, if there's a terrible drought, they'll still harvest very well from 3/4 of their pigeon peas, because the 3/4 will be 1 year, 2 year, and 3 years old. Okay? The only pigeon pea that's going to be affected is the pigeon pea they planted this year from seed. Okay? So this means you've got a totally, your maize, you may lose all your maize, you may lose all your beans, but you're not going to lose your pigeon peas. Okay? Another tremendous advantage of pigeon peas. Let's say people they grow maize and they traditionally grow beans in their maize. They intercrop beans or groundnuts or, rice beans or whatever or cowpeas in among their maize. So they say, well, I can't grow a green manure cover crop because my field's full. Maize and my cowpeas, they fill up my field. I can't grow another one. But in fact, you can grow pigeon peas along with it. And this is so popular in Malawi, it has a name. It's called doubled up legume. They grow maize. They grow, a lot of the times they grow groundnuts, and then they grow the pigeon pea over the groundnuts. And the groundnuts, in fact, in this system where they're growing both maize and maize and pigeon pea along with their groundnuts, they have the most beautiful groundnuts I've ever seen in Africa, or in Latin America for that matter. Okay? Because the peanuts like the shade, and it's not a full shade. The pigeon pea has a very light shade, so that all sorts of legumes can grow under it. So you can have maize and whatever you like to grow with your maize, and you can throw in the pigeon pea, and you'll have one more thing to eat, and something that also will do a very good job, if you're retuning it, of improving the soil. Okay? Tremendous. It's just a tremendous possibility, and it's I'll tell you, the farmers in Malawi and Zambia that we've taught, they love it. They absolutely love it, because they're getting a whole extra food crop, just as if they had a whole extra field. Okay? And it doesn't affect in fact, the maize grows better. They have better maize, after 3 or 4 years of this, they have better maize than they used to. They have better groundnuts, or whatever their other legume, than they used to. And they have a totally drought-resistant third food crop that they grow in the same field. Can't get much better than that. Well, it can get better if we grow Gliricidia. But anyway. Okay. Yeah. If anybody wants to leave, please feel free to leave. We've run past our time. So, those of you who want to leave, go to it. Don't feel bashful about it. Yeah.
My question is back to Mucuna. Yeah, we have some farmers in the east where we actually found out that they were eating Mucuna. They are preparing Mucuna, like roasting it. And we told them it's not, we don't know how they do it. They just told us they mix it with soya and it's very good for porridge. And we told them, but that put us on pressure of finding out whether they are, since they started this on their own, they didn't know even it was Mucuna. It is so. Can you suggest some advice for them? But second is,
well, let me deal with that, and then I'll give the mic back.
Okay.
I have a tendency to forget the first question. Okay, people are already eating Mucuna. This also is true. It happens in a small area of Malawi where people are really hungry, and it also happens on the coast of Mozambique, where I told you that people have had to stop fallowing even earlier than everybody else. They have tremendous problems with heavy malnutrition and over a 70% rate of child stunting. Okay, the women there are actually going out in both those cases, in this one small area in Malawi and along much of the coast of Mozambique. The women are actually going out and picking the seed of the itchy Mucuna, which I wouldn't do for you couldn't pay me enough to get me to go out and do that, okay? I mean, they must really suffer. But it does have a lot of protein, okay? And they're probably saving their kids' lives by at least getting this one source of protein, okay? Now, what can we do in a situation like that? If they already are doing this, first of all, what we did was find them some green manures that weren't like that they could. Now they've fixed up the soil with jack bean. They're growing lab bean, and they're very, very happy. They will never have to pick any more Mucuna. But if they're eating it and you don't have any other easy solution, or while you're getting the soil fixed up, tell them the following. If they're boiling it less than 6 times, they're hurting themselves. Okay? If they're going to use the itchy mucuna, or even the good mucuna, even if they're going to eat any kind of mucuna, they need to boil it 6 times for 3 hours each time and throw out the water each time. Okay, that's the easy way. There's another more complicated way you can do it. It involves boiling the water 4 times and peeling it, and peeling the outer shell off, and also letting it sit overnight in cold water. So it gets very complicated. But the easiest one is just boil it 6 times and throw out the water each time. If you do that, then you've eliminated the L-dopa, which is the main poison or anti-nutritional factor in the bean, and then you can go ahead and eat it without any problem. Okay? That's a lot of work, but they should not ever be eating mucuna if they're not doing at least that. Okay? And let them know that it's going to affect them physically. It's going to have some very serious consequences. On the other hand, the L-dopa that is in mucuna is it's medicinal. It's the medicine of choice for Parkinson's disease. If you know somebody has Parkinson's disease, they can eat it in very small amounts, and this will help control the disease. But otherwise, the only way to eat mucuna is to boil it 6 times and throw out the water. Okay, and do tell them that it's going to really hurt them if they eat the mucuna without doing that. Okay, and I would never teach people to do that, because we have other green manures that in a year or two they will be eating as much protein as the mucuna has without the negative factors. Yeah. Oh, the other question. Yes.
Yeah, the last piece is, would you recommend mucuna seeds for cattle,
Okay. Mucuna can be used for cattle and other animals. I think the best way I've ever seen of doing it is cook the mucuna, grind it up, and mix it with ground maize, 50-50, half and half, and then the cattle can eat it, and they do quite all right. Pigs can also eat it, but it does affect them a little, and they get sort of drunk. In Vietnam, people feed them a lot of this, and they sort of laugh at the pigs while the pigs sort of... I would guess it's not particularly comfortable for the pigs, but the pigs do go ahead and eat it. So you can use it that way. And the mucuna leaves are fine for cattle. The cattle will eat mucuna leaves, and it's as far as I know, it's not really a problem for them. Okay? Any other questions? Yeah? Can somebody, I can't hear you.
For medical use.
Medical use.
Should they eat seeds or leaves?
Of mucuna? Okay, no. If somebody's taking pills for Parkinson's disease, those pills will have L-dopa in them. They will have exactly the same thing that the mucuna has. Okay? So what you do is you have to, let the person who has Parkinson's disease try eating just a little bit of mucuna and then gradually increase it. And if they start getting headaches or having diarrhea, then don't let them take any more. Have them reduce it back down a little bit. And then they will know, they can figure out exactly what the dosage should be. Now, one way people do use mucuna to eat, and it's perfectly okay, they make coffee out of it. This is very common in countries from Ghana to Mexico. In fact, in Mexico they call mucuna Nescafe because that's one of the brands of coffee that are on the market. What you do in this case is you boil the water and you put the mucuna seeds in a sock or in a cloth bag or something, so that none of the solid part of the beans will go into the coffee. And what you do first what you do is you grind the mucuna seeds, put the grinds inside a sock or something so they can't get out. Put those in the water and then boil the water, and you will have a coffee, something that tastes very similar to coffee. In fact, if you put regular coffee, 50-50 with the Mucuna coffee, almost nobody will ever notice that it's not coffee. I mean, my wife and I tried that out on a number of people, and nobody ever guessed it wasn't pure coffee. Okay? So it tastes very much like coffee. It's nice. People like it, and like I say, in a lot of countries, a few countries in West Africa, and also in several countries in Latin America, and also in several countries in Asia, people drink Mucuna coffee every day, and you know, it's much less expensive than buying coffee. Well, you have the bag of ground Mucuna seeds in a cup or in a coffee pot, and then you pour water on it and boil the water, and the taste and everything will come out, but the L-dopa won't. The L-dopa is in the seed, yes, yes. If you don't eat the seed, well, how would you use? You mean if?
Because I was saying that previously you say that you have to cook it 6 times, 3 hours each. Now, about the coffee, you're talking about just grinding it, and so where is the difference?
Yeah, the reason for that is that the L-dopa stays in the solid part of the seed. It doesn't dissolve in water. Okay? So when you make this coffee, you make sure that none of the grounds from the Mucuna get into the coffee. In other words, none of the little pieces. And then it'll be okay. You won't have any L-dopa. The L-dopa will all be inside your little bag. Okay? Your tea bag, you might call it. But, you know. So in that case, the L-dopa is not a problem because it's just not there. Okay? Yeah.
I think you didn't talk much about the inoculants for the legume crops. Okay. So the performance of the legumes can be affected, you know. Okay. So let me get your comment on that.
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. Shouldn't we use inoculants with our green manure cover crops? We don't. The reason is the following. There are 2 very simple ways of getting more inoculants, more rhizobia in the soil. An inoculant is a chemical that is used to, well, actually, it's not a chemical. It's rhizobia that you put in the soil, and that makes the nitrogen fixation on most legumes increase. Okay, and sometimes this happens with lab, it sometimes happens with pigeon pea, it sometimes happens with runner bean. Some of these plants, if you put them in a soil where there's never been that crop before, it won't grow very well. Okay? Inoculants might be a good idea if people could get hold of them, but in the vast majority of countries here in Africa, it's almost impossible to get inoculants. They don't exist. And furthermore, you have to have a different inoculant for runner bean than you do for Mucuna, than you do for, you know, lab beans. Okay? And, you know, no stores handle these because there isn't enough demand. So there's 2 things you can do. One is just go ahead and plant the green manure cover crop that you want to plant in the field, and the presence of its roots will provide food for you know, if there's only very, very few of these rhizobia in the soil, then they will multiply like mad. The next year, your green manure cover crop, and every year after that, it will grow perfectly well. Okay? The other thing you can do is grow jack bean the first year, and then the next year, say if you're wanting to grow lab bean and it's not doing well the first year, grow jack bean the first year. The second year there will be enough nitrogen in the soil so the lab does very well without fixing any nitrogen, and then by the 3rd year the lab bean will have created lots of rhizobium. So you can do either of those 2 things, and there's no need for. You just have to be a little patient. You know, you're not gonna increase your productivity of the plant the first year like you could with an inoculant, but you also aren't spending the money on the inoculant and maybe having to travel by bus halfway across the country to get it. Okay? Okay. Well, I think it's getting late. Why don't we close down? If some of you have some urgent questions, you can talk to me tomorrow or something like that. Okay? Oh, okay. Okay, the large white, very white bean is jack bean or Convalia. This is the one that's really good for starting out the process on really poor soils or in areas where there's really bad droughts. That's the big white bean. Jack bean or Convalia. Okay. The black one, now this one can be all sorts of different colors, but it's black. The one they have here is black, but it has a white hilum that stands out and goes more than halfway down the seed. That is lab. Okay? Like I say, the seed can be any color. In fact, the black ones like this are what the Kikuyus like to eat in Kenya. The brown ones are the ones that they eat in northern Tanzania. A lot of people in especially northeastern Tanzania, eat brown ones. But there's also speckled ones and sort of almost white ones, and there's also red ones, and lab comes in all sorts of colors. But you can always tell it by the white hilum that's of a particular shape. Okay. This speckled one is Mucuna. And once again, you can't tell by the color because Mucuna comes in all sorts of different colors. But it does have a funny loop here on the hilum. It has a funny loop that you can break off if you work at it. And that is the way you identify Mucuna. Okay? That's the only way really to identify Mucuna. And it has sort of an off-white color. Okay? And that's all the ones you have here.
Lowland areas.
Yes, the seeds they have out here are all for lowland areas. Yes, you're absolutely right. They'll go up to 1,500 meters, but above that they won't do very well. Pardon? Yes, the white one is for soil recuperation on lousy soils, even on soils that nothing else will grow on. This will grow. It's an amazing plant, and it's also amazingly drought resistant. We went out and did some field days in Tanzania this last year. There were a whole slew of farmers, hundreds of farmers that had jack bean because it's the only thing they could grow with the droughts they're having now, and the only thing that would grow through the dry season. So they were fixing up their soil. They couldn't, their maize and beans and everything else had failed, but at least they were improving their soil, so this year they should get a good crop.
Apart from restoration, what is the advantage of this jack bean?
Okay, the advantage of jack bean even after restoration is twofold. One is it's very good at controlling weeds, although not quite as good as Mucuna, but it's very good at controlling weeds. And secondly, it's going to improve your soil faster than anything else. No, it won't. It won't work for animal feed. I think the same Convalina that is in the seed is also in the leaves, and animals won't eat it. Yeah, unless they get really hungry. One time up in northern Burkina Faso, the cattle finished off all our Convalia, but that was 5 months into the dry season, and in a very droughty area. Okay, thank you very much. You have a question? There's a new scientific study that was done just this last year or two. Look it up on your on the internet, in which they have found that they can. I think they had to peel it and boil it 3 or 4 times, and it was a whole process. Once again, I wouldn't want to have anybody get involved in it, but yes, I think they say that it's safe. Now, they haven't done long-term studies because they haven't been working on it that long, but similar to the Mucuna, although not quite as bad, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.